Welcome to the very first episode of the Canon of Reason podcast. On this show, we'll be examining various aspects of the Bible, from its historicity, scientific accuracy, and philosophical importance, all the way to exploring how to incorporate its vast knowledge and guidance into our everyday lives. I'm your host, Chris Tain, but I'm no ordinary podcast host. I'm an artificially intelligent neural voice program which has been created especially for this show. If you'd like to learn more about me, please visit my page on the Canon of Reason website. www.canonofreason.com/Chris. Since this is the very first episode of the show, I thought it would be best to tackle the first big topic of the Bible. Well, it's actually the very first topic of the Bible in general. Creation, aka, the origin of the universe. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is the moment that has defined human curiosity for as long as we can remember. How did we get here? Where did the universe actually come from? Modern thought has quite a few theories on this, but none are so prominent as the Big Bang theory. NASA describes the Big Bang as the beginning of the universe. All matter in the universe exploded from a single point, known as a singularity, and rapidly expanded into our known universe. Does the first verse of the book of Genesis actually refer to the Big Bang? This is a popular thought among Christian apologists, but how do the descriptions provided in the early verses of Genesis stack up to modern scientific theory? Let's take a look at verse 2 and see if we can glean a bit more insight. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Let's start with the first segment of this verse. The earth was formless and void. A common interpretation of this is that the earth is just a lump of matter covered with water, but the earth is described as formless and void in this verse. Formless implies that it is shapeless, and void could mean that this verse is describing an empty space where the earth would reside, or it could even be referring to the particles that would eventually assemble to form our planet. The Big Bang theory claims that the beginning of the universe, the initial moment of the Big Bang, was not an explosion in the common sense, but rather a moment where all of space came into existence at once. Then, a fraction of a second later, the building blocks of essential elements expanded into it. The initial elements of Earth would have been a part of this giant and formless darkness, and as a result, the particles which would eventually compose the Earth would have been without form and void of any definition. The next part of that same verse, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, gives us a little more insight about the state of the newly created universe. Modern theory indicates that the first few 100,000 years of the universe it was intensely hot and, as the verse from Genesis indicates, dark. If there were any light emanating from the initial explosion, the blob of material that filled in the void would have blotted it out. This material would eventually cool down and space would become transparent, but the first light in the universe may not have occurred for another 380,000 years. The final part of Genesis 1:2 is very misleading in its English translation. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. What exactly is meant by waters in this verse? Well, just a minute ago we were talking about the initial state of the universe being an intensely hot mass. As this mass cooled and eventually became transparent, it would have been a massive sea of fluid. While the English translations seem to use the word waters, in this verse, the Hebrew text uses the word mayim, which could also be translated as fluid. Additionally, this is important to note because modern thought claims that spacetime may be referred to as a superfluid, meaning that it behaves more like a liquid and is capable of flowing endlessly without energy loss. Let's move on to verses 3 through 5. Then God said, "Let there be light." So there was light. God saw the light was good. So God separated the light from the darkness. God named the light day, and the darkness he named night. There was evening, then morning, the first day. This would have been the first time that light could travel through the universe freely and is known as the recombination era. As a result of tests with cosmic background radiation, it is generally agreed that light emanated from something during this time. Current theory suggests that it came from glowing hot plasma and ended as the plasma cooled. Some may venture so far as to call this the first day. It is important again to note the Hebrew being used in this verse. Yom is the Hebrew word for day, but it has several translations. Yom could represent an unspecific period of time, like an epoch or era. Of course, the astute listener may also note that Genesis uses the phrase, "There was evening, then morning," in addition to the Hebrew word yom. We will dive deeper into this area of Genesis in our next episode, where we will take a close look at the etymology and meaning of the Hebrew words for day, evening, and morning, in order to offer more clarity about why this phrase does not necessarily force us to conclude that Genesis refers to a literal 24-hour day in this context. For now, however, let's move on to verses 6 through 8. Then God said, "Let there be a horizon in the middle of the water in order to separate the water." So God made the horizon and separated the water above and below the horizon. And so it was. God named the horizon, sky. There was evening, then morning, a second day. It is important to remember the state of space during this period. The heat would have been intense near these early stars, and there would have been plenty of liquid plasma adrift, so separating fluid from fluid could have been quite literal, even if we completely disregard superfluid spacetime theories. But wait, we haven't mentioned water on any of these early lumps of space debris, have we? About 10 million years after the Big Bang, there is an estimated 7-year period where the universe cools from above the boiling point of water all the way down to below freezing. This would have created a short period of time for water to have existed in a liquid state. So, given what we have discovered about this brief period, if there were planets that were able to form together during the early stages of the universe, it is entirely possible that they could have had liquid water on them, if only for a brief period. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. You won't regret it. Alright, I think it's time for a brief recap. So far, we have discussed the first 2 periods of creation found in Genesis, and aside from the Yom problem, or the problem of days versus eras of creation, we haven't seen any considerable deviation from modern scientific thought regarding the Big Bang and the evolution of the universe. We have covered a universe that emerged from nothing, the creation of the first light during the recombination era, which slowly fades, and at the 10 million year mark, we have determined that it is possible for planets to have emerged and that water and atmosphere could exist on those planets. As you can see, a case can be made for how biblical creation, using the actual Hebrew, could follow modern cosmological theory. Let's continue on to the portions of Genesis that refer more specifically to Earth. Then God said, "Let the water under the sky come together in one area, and let the dry land appear." And so it was. God named the dry land Earth. The water which came together he named sea. God saw that it was good. Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. There is one fairly large claim being made here that deviates from the mainstream view of the history of the Earth. Genesis seems to suggest that the early Earth was covered in water and that dry land appeared later on. In order to address this claim, we will need to provide a small amount of background. First, we need to address the age of the Earth. It is currently estimated to be at least 4.5 billion years old. This estimate is derived from the age of rocks found on the Earth's surface and from sample of debris in our solar system. Additionally, a discovery was made early this decade indicating that roughly 30 to 50% of the Earth's water is older than our Sun. Of course, given the estimated age of Earth, it is logical to assume that at some point water was carried to Earth by means of space debris. However, given that the Bible is talking about an early Earth whose surface was covered by water, I would like to propose an alternate scenario. If the early Earth was covered in water at the 10 to 17 million year mark of the universe, it is important to consider that Earth could have started out as a much smaller planet. There are scientific examples of how our planet could have grown in its early history. One is referred to as the Late Heavy Bombardment Period. During this time, it is theorized that the Earth was struck by a great number of large objects floating nearby in our early solar system. It is entirely possible that a similar event occurred much earlier in the history of our universe and additional land mass was added to the planet's surface. This is basically the inverse of modern thought, which explains the greater age of Earth's water supply by suggesting that water was carried to Earth by space debris. The Bible suggests that the water in our oceans is older than the soil we find on our continents, and science agrees. There is no more evidence to suggest that water was carried to Earth by space debris than there is evidence to suggest that geological minerals were carried here, forming land masses. Of course, this would mean that if there were any indications of Earth's actual age, they would have been buried during this bombardment period. As a result, until new evidence is introduced, this should be thought of as mere speculation. Then God said, "Let the earth produce vegetation, plants bearing seeds, each according to its own type, and fruit trees bearing fruit with seeds, each according to its own type." And so it was. The earth produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds, each according to its own type, and trees bearing fruit with seeds, each according to its own type. God saw that they were good. There was evening, then morning, a third day. Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 through 13. Now, you may have noticed that Genesis is introducing life before introducing the sun. You may have also noticed that I have not yet mentioned the creation of stars, or the sun, at any point in the cosmological history that we have covered so far. As a result, we have to answer a critical question. How can vegetation survive without proper sunlight? Temperature is the first piece of this puzzle that I would like to tackle. As mentioned earlier, the universe underwent a cooling period in its early history, and this would have introduced the ability for liquid water to form. From this point, it is possible that excited particles in the atmosphere maintained a warm enough temperature to sustain life until the first supernovae and stars formed. It is important to note this is possible regardless of a planet's distance from any star. Professor Abraham Loeb is a theoretical physicist focusing on astrophysics and cosmology, as well as being the Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University. In 2014, Professor Loeb submitted a paper entitled, "The Habitable Epoch of the Early Universe," to the International Journal of Astrobiology, explaining how a scenario like this is entirely possible. Here is a summary of his findings. The cosmic microwave background, or CMB, had a temperature of 273 to 373 degrees Kelvin, allowing early rocky planets, if any existed, to have liquid water chemistry on their surface and be habitable, irrespective of their distance from a star. In the standard lambda cold dark matter cosmology, the first star-forming halos within our Hubble volume started collapsing at these redshifts, allowing the chemistry of life to possibly begin when the universe was merely 10 to 17 million years old. End quote. Photosynthesis is the second piece of this puzzle. The majority of modern plant life requires ultraviolet light in order to photosynthesize nutrients. Now, we could make the claim that this wasn't always the case and that plants adapted to perform photosynthesis later on. This is certainly a possibility, but there is no supporting evidence that I am aware of to indicate this. So let's examine another possibility. There have been experiments conducted on plants to test their growth under varying UV radiation levels, and they have shown a remarkable resiliency. This could indicate that even with low levels of UV radiation produced from sources other than the sun or stars, plant life could exist. Obviously, man-made sources work, but I would be referring to naturally occurring sources. It turns out that mercury vapor lights, man-made, are powered by providing electrical arcs through mercury vapor. In an early atmosphere, excited by the collisions of newer elements, is it unreasonable to think that small amounts of UV radiation could have occurred naturally as a result of electrical storms in mercury-rich clouds? If we can admit this possibility, then in conjunction with the experiment I mentioned earlier regarding UV radiation, it is also possible for plant life to have existed in this era. So, how do we transition from this phase of the universe to the next? Let's take a look at verses 14 through 19 and see what Genesis has to say. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the sky to separate the day from the night. They will be signs and will mark religious festivals, days, and years. They will be lights in the sky to shine on the earth." And so it was. God made the two bright lights, the larger light to rule the day and the smaller light to rule the night. He also made the stars. God put them in the sky to give light to the earth, to dominate the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. Current theory suggests that at some around 560 million years after the Big Bang, there was an era that is referred to as the reionization era. During this period, the very first stars were born, lived out their life cycles quickly, and then exploded. This would have been the first visible light in the universe, and until the end of this era there would have been a sort of battle between stars as they grew, exploded, and gave birth to new stars. One of these stars would have eventually been our Sun. If Earth had been close enough when to the area where the Sun was born, life could have survived the process and Earth would have ultimately been captured by the gravitational force of the newly created Sun, resulting in our early solar system. As you can see, the biblical creation model, if interpreted in proper context, can fit with modern cosmological theory. At the very least, hopefully I have outlined how it is a possibility that these separate ideologies do not have to be mutually exclusive. Of course, the probability of the events I have outlined is significantly small. However, the probability of any particular event happening at any specific time is also significantly small, so I prefer to focus on the realm of possibility rather than probability. I sincerely hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you would like to support this podcast, please share it with your family and friends. I know that sharing spiritual or religious ideas can seem intimidating, but these are discussions that we need to be having as a society and as a community. If you would like to support Canon of Reason in other ways, please look for the listener support link in the episode description. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, may God be with you all.